Hi, guys. Welcome to the final section of this chapter. And this one is workers in the labor movement. So the last two sections were basically how did we get the Industrial Revolution and, kind of who controlled the shape of that. And this one is about how do the people that are working in that system end up reacting to it. And one of the major trends is they organize into labor unions, which had not existed before this. And so the question is for you, for your focus question, what impact did these labor unions make? So the argument by groups like the American Federation of Labor, which is still this country's largest labor union, was that the organized worker, meaning the union worker, this guy right here, is bringing the unorganized worker to better conditions. It's literally a long and winding road to better conditions with the sun over there. And it says every organized worker carries an unorganized worker, quote, strapped to his back. And so, that's the argument that you're going to get better conditions if you join a union and everyone else will benefit from it, even if they're not doing the work with you. So what really drives this is just absolutely terrible conditions in factories. You can see in the background of this image, we've got the overseers, they're wearing suits, they're men, mustache because it's the 19th century. And there's all these immigrant workers. This is in, I believe, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which is now a very wealthy neighborhood, but back then was a poor Jewish immigrant community. And they're sewing clothes. They're making, clothing for folks. So this is what's called a sweatshop. Basically, you're working in one of these places, you're working probably 10, 12, 14 hours a day. If you got injured because you're tired, then you have to pay for the things that you damage. You get blood on that coat. That coat is now, you have to buy it. You break it, you buy it. And so it's just brutal. If you got hurt, it's your fault. Your wages get docked. Basically, the best pay rates you could get in these industries is being a white man who was born in the United States. Immigrants would often get lesser wages, maybe sometimes not, depending on the industry. Sometimes immigrants were actually directly recruited to do certain jobs. Like, for example, in Florence, Massachusetts, they brought in French silk weavers because they were trying to set up a silk weaving industry there. Just things like that. But generally speaking, women would get paid about half as much as men. Children would get paid about a quarter as much. And if you were African American, you would get paid about the same as a white woman. If you were an African American woman, you might get paid as much as a white child, that kind of thing. So dangerous conditions, unfair labor practices, brutal, kind of just grind on people. So this is not limited to adults. You are all probably aware that there was a time in our history where child labor was common, to the tune of about 20% of all kids between 10 and 16 working in factories or mines, or in the case of this child, who's, God, I don't know. Take a guess at how old do you think she is? In the cotton fields. So one of the reasons there's actually an uptick in children working is because you have both parents in working class communities basically in factories, so the kids have to go somewhere. And this is before there's mandatory schooling. This is a child. This is kind of the New England version of that southern image I showed you just a second ago. I believe this is he's probably a boy of 4 picking, or 5 or 6 picking cranberries down on Cape Cod. You can see everybody stooped over in the back. These are a couple of scamps, selling newspapers. I know the history of this image. These are actually brothers. So the older brother is taking care of the 2 younger brothers. And again, just think about the ages of these children. They're standing on the street corner, every day. You can see this kid actually clearly outgrew his pants. Like you can imagine his middle brother wearing the same thing and then growing out of it. These are 2 girls, I believe, on the Cape again. I believe that's a clam bucket, and they're picking up clams out of the soil. And so, child labor, it was very, very common, and that's part of the reason we end up with public education. So there's something called a company town. So this is the town of Pullman, Illinois. It's right outside of Chicago. It's not a village of the city. And basically, if you build a new factory, you have a lot of money, you could set up as a capitalist who owns one of these factories, a whole village all around your situation. So you go to, Haydenville in Williamsburg. That was run by, I think his name was Joel Hayden. He built a factory town around his village. In places like modern day West Virginia, I guess it was West Virginia back then too, There are, you have company money that you get paid in, and then you can only buy goods from the company store and only rent company housing. So your boss would be your landlord and your grocery store keeper, and also the local bank and kind of the government effectively. So people were, more or less kept in wage slavery and weren't able to get out of these poverty traps. This is an example of company money. This is Olga Coal Company. So it's got a little thing in the middle. So they gave you a string of these coins, and you could only spend them in the store owned by the Olga Coal Company. And I think this one's West Virginia. So one of the kind of outcomes of all of this is the new popularity of socialism, which is this ideology that kind of comes out of the 1830s in Europe and then transfers through the work of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels to the United States. This gentleman pictured here is a 5-time presidential candidate named Eugene V. Debs. And he has a quote here: "I'm opposing a social order where it's possible for one man who does nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of $1,000,000, while millions of men and women who work all their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence." And so, the Socialist Party of the United States was not very popular initially, and then gains, I think, at its high point, 6 or 7% of the presidential vote. And they basically subscribe to what Karl Marx, the founder of the kind of modern sociology, says is this cycle of class struggle, that there's always a group being oppressed and there's always a group who is oppressing them. And so the socialists' argument was they were on the side of the oppressed. You have to have a very large beard to be a communist. And so these two gentlemen, Karl Marx on the left, Frederick Engels on the right, absolutely, have the bearded communist thing going for them. This is, again, just another illustration of what Karl Marx meant. I drew this. It's very, very accurate. So the proletariat are the workers, the have-nots, the oppressed, and the bourgeoisie are the capitalists, the haves, the oppressors. So socialist ideology really sets it up so it's, hey, there's one group to oppose, everybody else is in the same boat. You can hear echoes of this in, Occupy Wall Street or something, as we are the 99% against the 1%. It's the same argument, just like the robber barons versus captain of industry argument is the same one that started back in the early 20th century. So we're still living this history. Oh, let's see. This is an American. There's young Karl Marx with less of a beard, but you can see him growing into it. And this is a magazine published in the United States with the most famous line from the Communist Manifesto. And workers, the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains and a world to gain. So you can see the date 1911. And, this is the 9th issue. It's popular enough that it's continuing. So this is kind of the high point of American socialism. So in an unsocialist labor policies, there's a group founded called the Knights of Labor. And they're basically the first labor union in the United States. They're open for all religions, so that's big in this country in this time period of the, 1869. They actively recruit African Americans. They recruit skilled and unskilled workers, which I'll explain more when we talk about the labor union that replaces them. And they want to replace capitalism with workers' cooperatives. So in modern political terms, this would be a really progressive kind of organization. They do not survive the 19th century. The group that does is the American Federation of Labor, which advocates for racial segregation. It advocates for making narrow workplace improvements, and you have to be a skilled worker and a man to join this labor union. So they're much more exclusive, kind of the group of workers with the most power join the AFL. The reason the Knights of Labor end up being destroyed and the American Federation of Labor survives is because on May 1st, 1886, a day that would eventually be known as May Day, there was a worker meeting in Haymarket Square in Chicago. And these workers, you can see on the sign, or on this poster here, are advocating for the 40-hour work week and the 8-hour work day. The police are tipped off by basically themselves. They knew this meeting was going to happen, and they beat everybody up. And then a second meeting takes place 3 days later, which becomes known as the Haymarket Square Massacre, which is against police brutality. And an anarchist throws a bomb, which is an organization. Anarchists are not really an organization. Anarchists don't believe in government, and the police panic and they shoot into the crowd. They surrounded it, and they end up shooting each other and a bunch of the workers. So you can see also this poster is partially in German. So many of these workers, these immigrants, they speak German, so it's in their language. And xenophobia rises up, and immigrants are blamed for this massacre, and the Knights of Labor in particular. And their membership drops precipitously as the police raid their various headquarters. So this is an image that's published in the Chicago Tribune describing the Haymarket Square massacre. It depicts the events I just described as a battle. You see, like, there's one of the workers speakers is on this podium shouting at the crowd. You can see a person in the foreground who's a worker that looks like he's shooting at the police, and the police are responding to this giant explosion in the background. Here's another version of it that's from a British newspaper, which provides a very different sort of image. You can see again, both the police and the workers are firing weapons at each other, but there is no speaker shouting the workers on to go attack the police. And because, frankly, that's what happened, So the workers were armed, by the way, because there was, in this time period, there's a pretty regular amount of violence between workers and police. In the end, 4 of the accused, so basically leaders of the Knights of Labor, immigrants, are executed. And later on, the state of Illinois actually apologizes. And by later on, I mean, about 20 years ago, to these folks because they were wrongfully convicted of murder of the police. And this, event becomes known as May Day and the International Day of Worker Solidarity in other countries because it's seen as a miscarriage of justice from everywhere from Russia to England to Germany and the United States. Let's see, this is more documentation. You can take a look at this if you want to pause the video or look at the slideshow just from the Haymarket Square riot/massacre, the German version. And, just kind of continuing as far as labor unrest, there was the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892, where Andrew Carnegie cut his workers' wages by 60%, even as hours were increased to 12 hours per day. Workers joined this union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and go on strike. And you can see in this image here, they end up having to effectively be in a war against the Pinkerton Guards, which is this mercenary army hired by Andrew Carnegie's second in command to break the strike, which they do, but not after, I think, something on the order of 50 or 60 workers die. This is a criticism of Andrew Carnegie, and just the first line: Mr. Carnegie, you're worth several millions. Can't you give us enough wages to clothe and feed our families and send our children to school? And then they just respond with him being totally evil. It ends with, bah, fools, close the works and crush these people. So, robber barons or captains of industry. It depends on which sources you're looking at and whose perspective and what legacies. Last strike we're going to talk about is the Pullman strike. And this one is that village I showed you earlier, the village of Pullman, Illinois. Pullman produced luxury railroad cars. All of his workers were black that worked in the railroad cars, and he made them live in Pullman, Chicago. Then he cut wages by a quarter as there was a recession going on at the time, and they organized into the American Railway Union. Again, very subtle cartoon. It's got Pullman with an evil face and a top hat crushing a worker in a press labeled low wages and high rent. And money's coming out of the employee. Yeah, not subtle. Eugene Debs, that socialist candidate for president, the reason he ran for president so many times is he organizes 100,000 railroad workers to go on strike, which shuts down the country's economy. There is violence. The strike is eventually broken. The National Guard is actually called in by the U.S. president at the time. I believe it's Grover Cleveland. Excuse me. So this Pullman strike basically leads to further radicalization of some workers. And so you get this group called the IWW, the International Workers of the World. And they are, 100. They're not even Knights of Labor or progressive. They are advocates for socialism and the abolishment of governments and the organization of the entire world into one big union. But they have ties to both kind of the socialist movement and the anarchist movement. And the support for socialism only increases with groups like this, which actually still exist. Oops. And that's it. So just to get back to the beginning, why did workers organize into labor unions, and What is the impact and the significance of this?